in all our experience, whatever we experience, there is a subject and an object. There is an experiencer and there is the experienced. There is a seer and the seen. When I look at this microphone, the microphone is the object of my experience, I am the subject. I am the experiencer, the microphone is the experienced. I am the seer, and the microphone is the seen. And the subject and the object are different. They are different entities. The experiencer and the experienced are different entities. The seer and the seen are always different entities. And Vedanta takes advantage of this fact. It takes advantage of the fact that two things. First of all our experience is subject and object, seer and seen. And the seer and the seen are always different, number one. Number two, we always are the seer in any experience. We always know who are we? The subject of the experience, the experiencer, the seer. Now, holding on to these two facts, this text has taken us on a journey. It says, look at the world. With your eyes, look at the world. The things that you see are the objects of your vision. Your eyes are the subject. The eyes are different from what they see. The seer and the seen are different. Go deeper. The eyes themselves are the object of our experience. My eyes are open, closed, or whatever. When the eyes become the object of my experience, I am the experiencer of my eyes. Experiencer of my eyes means I know the condition of my eyes. I know whether they are open, whether they are closed, whether I can see, whether I cannot see. All these things I know. What knows? The mind. The mind is the experiencer, and the sense organs, the eyes and ears and nose and so forth, are the experienced. And the mind is different from the sense organs. So I must be the mind experiencing my own sensory system. Go deeper. The contents of our minds, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, ideas, memories, even the Vedanta that we are reading, they're contents of our minds. And we are aware of these contents. Are we not aware that we are happy or we are sad? That we understand or do not understand, as the case may be, but we feel it. So there is something within which is the subject for which the mind itself is an object. So mind becomes an object, the seen, and there's a subject, the witness of the mind, which is the ultimate subject according to Vedanta. Pure consciousness, the witness consciousness deep within us, that is what we really are, watching our minds. With our minds, we experience our bodies and sense organs. With our bodies and sense organs, we experience the world. We means that witness consciousness. Now, several questions will arise. You see, it's fine to logically divide ourselves into pure consciousness, the witness consciousness and everything else. Minds, sense organs, body and the world on one side, and the witness consciousness on the other side. We are the witness consciousness, and everything else we witness, they are seen, and we are the seer. But if you think about it, you will immediately say, wait a moment, you will immediately say that. There is a difference between the way we experience this book, for example, or the microphone, and the way we experience our bodies. You see, the first practical objection should be, it is true that the microphone or that device is different from me, and my body is not different in that way, because I feel my body. My body is part of my identity. I never say, I am a book or I am an electronic device. I can say it is my book, it is his electronic device, but I do not say I am these. But I say not only that it is my body, but I often say I am the body. I am tall or thin, male or female, young or old. These are characteristics of the body. So I identify with my body, which I do not with objects outside. And more precisely, why do we identify ourselves with our bodies? Because there is consciousness in the body. We are aware. We can touch our bodies. I feel the touch. I feel cold. I feel heat. If you pinch me, I feel pain. In one of the texts written by Shankaracharya, when he's talking about this discrimination between the body and the witness consciousness, the student says, "But sir, it hurts. Even after all this analysis, the body is an object, it still hurts. So why is it, if I am the witness consciousness, why is it that I feel consciousness in the body? Not only that, my sense organs are bright with consciousness. I see, it's a conscious experience. It's not just a witness, I'm actually seeing. I hear. You can touch me, I feel it. In the mind, I think, I have emotions, I have ideas. These are all conscious experiences. And there is consciousness here. So how does consciousness come to the body? From the witness consciousness, how does consciousness come to the body? How is it that the body feels conscious? So this is the question. And that we shall take up in the next verse. These are subtle questions. If the question is clear in our mind, the answer will be, it will be thrilling to read the answer. And we can check with facts. Isn't it true? What they are saying, it's true. Let's see. What do they say? Chichaya veshato buddhau, chichaya veshato buddhau, bhanam dhistu dvidha sthita, bhanam dhistu dvidha sthita, ekaham kritiranya syad, ekaham kritiranya syad, antakarana rupini, antakarana rupini. Okay. Let's talk about this and I'll come back to the Sanskrit. In Indian philosophy, there is a distinction between the self, the subtle body, and the gross body. The gross body is the physical body. The body which is sitting here, the body about which I say it weighs 60 kgs or 100 kgs or whatever. That's the gross body. And thoughts, emotions, feelings, memories, personality, all of that, the subtle thing within, it's called the subtle body. And beyond this is the Atman, the self, we ourselves. So the Indian philosopher, not just Vedanta, others too, they have a trichotomous view of the human personality. It's not just body-mind. It's body, mind, self. Gross body, subtle body, and the self. Gross body, subtle body, and the self. Trichotomous view, threefold view of the human personality. The word soul in English is ambiguous. When we say soul, S-O-U-L, soul, we have to make it clear whether we mean the mind or the self. The word soul in English comprises of both the self and the mind. They are put together in literature, in philosophy, even in science. It's together, the body and the soul. When we say body and soul, the body is the gross body. The soul, the word soul actually includes, it can mean either the subtle body or the self. So you have to make a distinction there. Now, in Vedanta we say the witness consciousness is reflected in the subtle body. The witness consciousness is reflected in the subtle body. The subtle body, our minds, have the capacity of reflecting the witness consciousness. The witness consciousness is reflected in our minds. And it is called the reflected consciousness. So you have two now, witness consciousness, reflected consciousness. The reflected consciousness is a reflection of the real witness, the Atman, the pure consciousness in the mind. Nothing very fancy here. Just now we feel conscious. We all, I hope we feel conscious. Because Vedanta has a way of switching off consciousness. If we look inside, we feel, we are aware, we are thinking, we are feeling, we are trying to understand, we see, we hear. All this is consciousness. And the consciousness that we feel inside is exactly this reflected consciousness. The consciousness, the sentience, the awareness which we feel right now, all of us, is that reflected consciousness. The mind gets consciousness from this reflected consciousness. Pure or witness consciousness reflected in the mind or the subtle body. Reflected consciousness. And that reflected consciousness shines in the mind, and the mind gets consciousness. It borrows consciousness. And the mind which has borrowed consciousness illumines, reflects that consciousness, sends that consciousness, transmits that consciousness to our sensory system. And our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, they all, lights are thrown on, Lights come on there. One by one, the lights come on. It's just like at night when you look up there, the sky and the earth are illumined. By what? By the moonlight. We see the moonlight. But if you know, we all know, the moon doesn't have light of its own. It borrows light from the sun and reflects it back on the earth. And we use that moonlight to see things at night. And when we were kids in school, we have all read list of luminous bodies. Before we go deeper into physics, we read list of luminous bodies in the sky, sun and moon and stars. But we are making a mistake there, which is explained later on as we grow older. The moon does not belong in the same category as the sun and the stars, because the moon does not have light of its own. It borrows sunlight, reflects it on earth, and it's as good as light, because we can use that light to see and do work at night. But we know, even though the moon is shining, for all practical purposes it is giving us light, but we know beyond the horizon, we cannot see it, but the sun is shining forth, and its light is falling on the moon and comes to the earth, by which we experience light, moonlight. Exactly like that, the mind and the sense organs do not have consciousness of their own, Vedanta says. It is the witness consciousness, the sakshi, the witness consciousness which we arrived at in the last two classes. That witness consciousness shining on the mind becomes the reflected consciousness. And that reflected consciousness illumines the mind. And the sense organs borrow consciousness from the mind. And the body now borrows consciousness from the sensory system. To the point that the sensory system functions, the Upanishad says, Anakagrat, I have spread myself up to the tips of my fingernails. I have spread myself up to the tips of my fingernails. Up to this point, I am. We all feel that right now. Beyond this, I am not. This is me, this is not me. How does that work? Because this body is conscious. Where did the body get consciousness from? Does it belong to the body? No, it does not belong to the body. How do you know it does not belong to the body? Because sometimes the body is conscious, and when the body dies, or when we fall unconscious, the body loses consciousness. It does not act as a conscious being anymore. So the body does not have its own consciousness. You see, there is this concept of intrinsic consciousness and borrowed consciousness. What's the difference? Borrowed consciousness is that which comes and goes. Intrinsic consciousness is that which stays. A very simple example would be when we cook. The fire is burning, and we put a vessel on the fire, and we put water in the vessel, and we put vegetables in the water. After some time, the vegetables are hot. They get boiled. So the vegetables, the heat of the vegetables, the heat in the vegetables, does it belong to the vegetables? If it did, it would always be hot. But if you switch off and when you serve it, put it out there, very soon the vegetables are cold. So the heat does not belong to the vegetables. When they were in the refrigerator, they were cold, and in the pan they are hot. When you serve them out, after some time they become cold. So it becomes cold because the heat in the vegetables was borrowed. Borrowed from what? From the boiling water. Does the water have heat of its own, intrinsic heat? No. Because it was cold earlier, now it's boiling. And after some time it will become cold again. Therefore it has borrowed its heat. Where has the water borrowed the heat from? From the pan, which is red hot. Does the pan have heat of its own? No. It's borrowed its heat. Where has it borrowed its heat from? From the fire. And the fire, where has it borrowed its heat from? It has heat of its own. As long as the fire lasts, it will be hot. It has intrinsic heat. Whenever the fire is there, it is hot. Consciousness is borrowed in the body from the sensory system, the nervous system. And the sensory system has borrowed consciousness from the mind. And the mind has borrowed consciousness from the reflected consciousness. And the reflected consciousness is borrowed from the sakshi, the witness consciousness. And the witness consciousness is borrowed from nobody. It is intrinsic consciousness. It is consciousness itself. It's always there. It's always consciousness. Whereas the mind and the sensory system lose consciousness. In deep sleep, not conscious. And in death, when the mind, the subtle body goes away to other worlds, maybe to other births, then the body lies dead. No longer do we say, that is me. We don't say that. So, the body has borrowed consciousness from the sensory system from the mind from the reflected consciousness in the mind, and the reflected consciousness is borrowed from the witness consciousness, the sakshi, which we are. We lend consciousness to this, and then up to the tips of my fingers, I say, I am conscious. That accounts for the difference between this body and this microphone. Though this body is an object of experience, this microphone is also an object of experience. What causes confusion is there is consciousness in the body. That's why we feel, I am this body. But the fact is, I am not this body. Now let us look at the verse. We'll see it's very easy to understand. For those of you who are following the Sanskrit, Chitchaya veshato buddho bhanam. In the subtle body, in the buddhi, in the subtle body, various terms are used. In the subtle body, Chitchaya. Literally it means the shadow of consciousness. This is the sixth verse. Chitchaya means, literally it means the shadow of consciousness. Or in our terms, reflected consciousness. Reflected consciousness shines in the mind, and hence we get bhanam, knowledge. What knowledge? Every knowledge. All kinds of knowledge are possible: seeing, hearing, thinking, understanding, loving, hating, wanting, meditating. All of that is possible because of the reflected consciousness in the mind. Now, he does something here. Dhis tu dvidha sthita. The mind, let us divide it into two parts. Now he's dividing the mind itself, the subtle body, into two parts. In Vedanta, normally we divide the inner instrument, what is called the antakarana, into four parts: mind, intellect, ego, memory. Mana, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta. If you know the famous hymn of Shankaracharya, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. So it starts off with Mano buddhi ahankara chittani naham. I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the ego sense, I am not the memory also. Now, this is how Vedanta divides the inner, the antakarana. But here, the author has done something different, and on purpose. We'll very soon see what the author has done. The author says, look inside, look at the mind, divide it into two parts. One part, the I sense, ego. What's that? It's exactly what you're feeling now, what I'm feeling now, the I. Just think, I. I, Sarvapriyananda, I am sitting here, I am speaking, the I. That's one part of the mind. The other part of the mind, the rest of the mind. Intellect, the mind itself, memory, manas, buddhi, and chitta. That's the rest of the mind. And the ego. He isolates the ego from the rest of the mind. That bears repeating. What he has done now, look at the mind, you will find there are many things going on in the mind. There is thinking, there is feeling, there is memory coming up, there is understanding, and there is also something called the I. An ego sense, which comes up all the time. I. Focus on the I, leave the rest aside. Why does he do that? You see, that's what's most important to us. Who is most important to us? First person, I. Okay, focus on that I. Now, having isolated that, he goes to the next verse. Chaya Ahankarayoraikyam Taptaya Pindavanmatam Tadahankaratadaatmyat Dehashchetanatamagat. It will be very easy to understand now. What he says, the I sense in our mind, the ego sense. Remember, what else is there in the mind? The reflected consciousness. The reflected consciousness all the time. In the mind, the reflected consciousness is there. The reflected consciousness and the I, they become one. How do they become one? Just like when I look in a mirror, there's a reflected face in the mirror. When I look in a mirror, there's a reflected face in the mirror, and the reflected face and the mirror are one. They become identified. You cannot separate them. Whenever there is a mirror, there will be a reflection. So the reflection and the mirror are one. The reflection here is the reflected consciousness. Your face is the original consciousness, the witness consciousness, and the mirror is the I sense. Mirror is the I sense, ahankara. The ahankara, the I sense, ego, and the reflected consciousness are one, like the reflection and a mirror. They become one. And the ego catches the reflected consciousness and transmits it to the rest of the mind, and the mind transmits it to the sensory system, and the sensory system transmits it to the body. He's showing how this body feels conscious. You see. Tad ahankara tadatmya. Look at the Sanskrit now. Because of the identification with the ego. Identification of ego and what? Don't get confused. Ego and the reflected consciousness. The ego and the reflected consciousness, because they are identified, they become virtually identical. The ego becomes conscious. Just look inward. Let's look inside and we feel I. And it feels like the most conscious thing we have. The most conscious thing we experience is my I-ness. And that I-ness now transmits consciousness throughout the mind, through the sensory system, up to the ends of the body. Wherever the sensory system is functioning, we will feel consciousness. That's what it has said. Chaya ahankarayor aikyam. The oneness of the reflected consciousness and the ego sense is like what? It uses an ancient example. Like a red hot iron ball. A red hot iron ball. Imagine an iron ball in a factory in a blast furnace. When you push it inside, it comes out. It's round, it's heavy, but it's also glowing red and it's hot. Now there are two things there. What are the two things? It looks like one thing. A red, hot, round thing, heavy thing. But there are two things there. The heat of that iron ball, that red hot iron ball, the heat does not belong to the ball. Heat belongs to fire. The round shape of that thing, it belongs to the iron ball, not to the fire. The glow, the red glow, belongs to the fire, not to the iron ball. The weight belongs to the iron ball, not to the fire. So the fire and iron ball are mixed together, becomes one. It just looks like one thing, a shining thing. Just like that, the ego is like the iron ball. And the reflected consciousness is like fire. The reflected consciousness in the mind is like fire. And the ego is like iron ball. Fire is a good example of consciousness because it's bright. And the iron ball is a good example of the ego because it's an insentient, a thought. And the two are identified together and they shine. And then what happens? Tad ahankara tadatmya. Because of identification with the I becomes identified with the reflected consciousness, and the I is identified with the mind and the body. Don't we feel? My thoughts, my ideas, my memory, my person. I is identified with the mind and the body also. I, this body. So the I, which is already shining with the reflected consciousness, is also identified with the body, and the body gets this reflected consciousness. And the body feels conscious. That accounts for the difference between this body and this microphone. Though this body is an object of experience, this microphone is also an object of experience. What causes confusion is there is consciousness in the body. That's why we feel, I am this body. But the fact is, I am not this body.